Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning into Health Podcast Show, the place to be to get the insights of leaders working at the intersection of health, science, and media. I'm your host, Dan Kendall, and this episode features a recording from the 2025 Health Podcast Summit, which was held on October 1st and 2nd. In total, we interviewed 42 speakers in 37 sessions that span topics across health, science, policy, and podcasting. You can wait to get access to all the sessions as we publish them here on your favorite platform, or you can get access to all the recordings, links, and resources by visiting our website at healthpodcast.org. Again, that's healthpodcast.org. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Health Podcast Summit 2025. I'm your host, Dan Kendall, and in this session, we feature two speakers, both from Children's Hospital Colorado. Jesse Cohen is a former national correspondent turned executive producer, and Melanie Douglas manages the physicians relation team. Together, they've grown a homegrown podcast entitled Charting Pediatrics, and it's become one of the top 5 pediatric podcasts worldwide. I should also note that they have both an English and a Spanish language version of this podcast, and links are included in the description below. In this session, they share how journalistic storytelling transforms medical education by going beyond the white coat and sharing vulnerable human experiences. They explain why dedicating full-time personnel after years of part-time management completely changed the quality of their content and its strategic impact. I'd like to take a moment to thank all our sponsors and partners who make Health Podcast Summit 2025 possible. A special thanks to our gold sponsor, BetterHelp, and to our silver sponsor, ZS. Please visit healthpodcastsummit.com for links to all these organizations and special offers. Let's turn to my conversation with Jesse Cohen and Melanie Douglas. Melanie, Jesse, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Health Podcast Summit.
Yeah, we're excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
When you guys submitted to speak to this summit, I was really impressed with the care that you took, really outlining some key points that you wanted to get across. I was really disappointed by the fact that this was the first time I'd ever heard about your podcast. You've been doing this for a long time. You are really students of the game, as I like to say. You have applied so many great practices to what you're doing, and this deserves to have more visibility and hopefully will inspire more people to tune in, but also inspire more people to create podcasts because you are doing such a fabulous job at the Children's Hospital of Colorado. So before we go into the presentation that you've prepared, I'd like for you just to give us a little bit of an update about the hospital itself, the podcast itself, and then introduce each of you in your roles. Can we start with you, Melanie?
Sure. Yeah, definitely nice to be here. So my name's Melanie Douglas. I'm the manager on our physician relations team. I've been with the hospital for 10 years. So currently I oversee operations, communications, strategic initiatives, special initiatives, including the podcast, which is definitely a bright spot in my role, especially partnering alongside Jesse. It's been a real treat to have her here these last 2 years at the hospital. And our hospital is located right here in Aurora, Colorado. We serve a 7-state region. We also really serve patients and families from across the world. And we are one of the top 10 children's hospitals in the nation. And this has really been a great opportunity with the podcast just to kind of continue to build national reputation and really be at the forefront of pediatric medicine.
Thanks, Mel. Well, my name is Jesse Cohen, and I am the executive producer as well as our managing editor of Charting Pediatrics. My background is I'm a former journalist and national correspondent, and I never really thought I'd find myself in the corporate space. But, lo and behold, life changes. And here I am 2 years later, getting to really spearhead a lot of the movement around this podcast, which has been extremely exciting. I really do everything from behind the camera to getting my voice out there. As a former multimedia journalist, I'm kind of a one-woman band. So everything from shooting, editing, writing, creating, I do it all. And I think that's been a nice surprise for Melanie and the rest of the team to sort of see me come alive in the last 2 years of helping bring all those skill sets to the forefront. So anything with Charting Pediatrics you hear, I have a hand in, and then getting to really talk about what the future of podcasting looks like at the hospital has been at the forefront. So I certainly help support our Spanish podcast, Pediatrics in Linea, and we will see what the future holds for additional podcast opportunities.
Thank you both for being here. And I know that you did not only do a great submission when you were applying to be a speaker, but you also put together a whole presentation. And there's a few slides here. We can jump through them. But if Jesse, if you could share your screen, I'd love to go through these slide by slide and understand a little bit more about the reason that you were creating a podcast and how this plays into your overall strategy. So can you bring that up for us?
So, really with our podcast being one of the top 5 pediatric podcasts in the world, we've become a really heavily relied upon resource. This certainly didn't happen overnight. We've been around for 9 years. So this concept for charting peds was really born back in 2017. We had a manager on our team who had a marketing background, and we have several different types of initiatives within physician relations that we call tools in our toolkit. So really saw this as an opportunity to kind of arm us with another educational vehicle to really engage with primary care providers. The intent was really to focus locally, reach other states in what we have a strategic 7-state region, but that quickly grew overnight, if you will. So it was really an organic, homegrown tool to really test out.
So you have a lot of tools at your disposal. You have video, you have your website, you have printed materials. You mentioned that you wanted to hit local physicians and some of the neighboring states, perhaps. Why were podcasts an attractive option 9 years ago for you to do this?
Yeah. So we have a team of 7 different physician relations reps. So we have reps here locally, we have them out in the region, and then we have some national reps more on the OB MFM side. But our team can only do so much in person, right? With traditional education, lunch and learn, CMEs, conferences, et cetera. So in addition to a traditional newsletter that we do produce every month for our community providers, this is just another great way for us to showcase our service lines, our magnetic programs. So our magnetic programs are really areas that are very subspecialized that we want to be worldwide leaders in. So think about colorectal, our Heart Institute is very prestigious, liver transplant, things like that. So it's a great way to really get real-time information out to the broader community beyond just kind of those traditional in-person and maybe even your Jesse, like traditional marketing vehicles. So I think this is a little bit of a unique space where we're blending, tactics of physician relations with, yes, some general marketing strategy, but also I think, as Jesse, I'm sure you hit on it, the podcasts are a completely new way to engage people, really tell our story, and even keep our hospital at the forefront of pediatric medicine.
And just to drive it home, then you're really focusing on those physicians. You're not trying to reach the general population. You're really focusing on targeting those primary care physicians, primarily pediatricians that are working in this area. And Colorado is a large state. There's a lot of rural areas of Colorado. I imagine a lot of people spend a lot of time in their cars. So was that part of the factor that you were trying to evaluate when you were deciding, do we make something more that's screen-based or video-based versus giving them something that can engage while their eyes are busy, but their mind is free?
I love that. And it's a great segue because Jesse and I hear often, people will listen to this on their drive to work, maybe while they're doing a load of laundry, doing chores around the house. There's a great quote we'll share at the end here from a listener. People use this to stay top notch on their education, study for exams. So it's really a great way to kind of take that traditional, in-person or didactic learning into a conversation and really that fireside chat. So this is just high level for charting pediatrics. So we're really proud. Over the years, we have listeners in 187 countries worldwide. Again, that was never really the intent. The goal is just really spread across the globe, which has been fantastic, really to get into the ears of different clinicians across the globe. And Dan, before I forget, one thing I also want to share, you talked about our target audience being primary care providers, which is definitely true. Of course, really anyone who cares for kids. But we also know we have a secondary following with parents and caregivers. So there's a lot of information, even myself being a parent, that's really digestible, that's produced on the podcast that can be really applicable and helpful for them in caring for their kiddos.
Well, that really affects things like the language that you use and the topics that you cover. So are you actually catering the content to accommodate the fact that there might be people who are not familiar with all the latest medical jargon?
Yeah, I mean, the way I always sort of think about it is the parents and the caregivers and the families are the cherry on top, right? They're not necessarily the goal or the focus. However, when we look at that PCP audience, they don't even really want that niche language that goes too in depth into an area of focus that they're not specialized in. Because for them, they have to be, the jack of all trades, but the expert of none. So they're trying to keep themselves as knowledgeable as possible. And so I think as we focus on that primary care population, it lends itself to a more natural conversation because they're also trying to have these difficult conversations with families. So a PCP, for example, who maybe hasn't seen a certain, let's see, diagnosis in the colon section, right, of the body, that they listen to an episode with us about the colon, they hear all of these very baseline terms, things that are digestible, easy to understand. They can then take that information and relay it back to the parent or the family member who's in the office with their kiddo. So while we're not necessarily being specific to target to families, we are being specific to target to very easy information that's easy for them to understand, easy for them to digest, and then to take and to apply it into their everyday practice. So I think kind of both things go hand in hand.
That makes a lot of sense to have that primary audience and then have, I sort of talk about it as rings around that primary audience. There are people who listen to Travis Kelce and they might be Taylor Swift fans. So there's always things that you can get that are not necessarily the target audience of football fans, but still appeal to other audiences. So thanks for that explanation.
Absolutely. And while we have the time, I guess I'll allude to, it's kind of what I said at the beginning. I think that podcasting has such an opportunity in the healthcare space. And as much as we've been around for 9 years, we are still at the beginning for Children's Hospital Colorado. In my mind, as a content expert, we need to be focused on sharing the right story in the right lanes. And I think right now, given that we only have this one podcast, we have accidental listeners, right? And so maybe the day will come that we have a podcast that's specific for parents. It's not to say that regardless of whatever the podcast is in the healthcare space, that another group can't learn and grow from it. But I think it just goes to show that the more niche your audience is, the more specific you can be to catering to them. And I think that's something we're excited to grow from. And I think everybody listening at this conference will definitely learn if they haven't already in their own spaces.
You have one podcast that I'm aware of that's in English, but you also have a second one that's in Spanish. Is that accurate?
That is true. Yeah. And just to give a little quick background there. So 4 years into charting pediatrics, obviously the pandemic hit. We recorded 50 additional bonus episodes. So really in addition to our Tuesday episodes, all things COVID. So there was an idea from the group really to say, hey, I wonder if there's an opportunity in the Spanish community. So our host, David Brumbaugh, is fully fluent in Spanish. So he hosted that episode on charting pediatrics in Spanish. It did incredibly well. It was the #1 downloaded episode from the COVID content, which really spurred the group at the time to say, hey, maybe there's an opportunity here for a sister podcast in Spanish, which now is how Pediatrics en Linea was born. So that's hosted by a single host, Dr. Carla Torres-Zagara. She's a pediatric dermatologist here at the hospital. They are inching closer and closer to that 100,000 download mark. They've got listeners in 104 countries. And I think what we're most proud of for them is they have listeners in all 20 countries where Spanish is recognized as their official language. So we cross-collaborate when we can, but these are really two kind of independent podcasts, certainly sisters, but also a little bit different, target audiences, right? So PEL is really looking at those Spanish-speaking countries where there are a lack of medical resources, maybe underserved communities. So really just working to get the word out about our programs and also arming them similarly with charting peds on how can they care for kiddos in their local community.
And I think PEL is a great example of we didn't necessarily know this was an audience we wanted to target. And then we saw that happen organically in real time. And we catered to the Spanish-speaking population. We have a lot of Spanish-speaking parents and patients, but most of the Spanish-speaking providers, at least here in Colorado, also speak English. And so this wasn't an obvious thing that, happened at the beginning. It was something that was learned. So just another, I think, just great lesson for all of us that as you get out there and you see who you reach and how you reach them, that things like this might pop up and be a great opportunity for your organization.
I just want to ask one thing about it, though, because I think you said it was the same content, but in Spanish, but your population has a strong Spanish speaking component. Do your professionals, I mean, they must be bilingual. I imagine most of your professionals are bilingual with English and Spanish. So is this one more intentionally focused at the, as you called it, the cherry on top, Jesse, in terms of that parent sort of audience?
So great question. I think we started it with the same intention of we were going to focus on primary care providers, but then we realized over time that the larger audience is those community members, those parents, because they have a lack of access to education. We have more guests on Pediatrics and Linea that are international than they are here nationally. So they're doing a ton of remote interviews, whereas for Charting Pediatrics, I would say 90% of who we have on the podcast is in person, and it's at our studio at the hospital. So yes, it's not the exact same topics. And I guess what I mean when I say it's the same content, it's, bread and butter general pediatric topics that we're trying to focus on, but the audience has definitely changed over time. And so I think education to all kinds for PEL in those Spanish-speaking countries is definitely more the focus, whereas here in the US, specifically for Charting Pediatrics, we're more so focused on that PCP population.
So before we go on to the next slide, I just want to go back to you, Melanie, for a question, because Jesse's been involved with this for a couple of years. You've been doing this for 9. So what happened in that first 7 years before you decided to bring Jesse on board? How is this being handled? And what were some of the opportunities that you were working to embrace and resource for those first 7 years with the team or the resources you had? And what made you pivot into bringing somebody on board?
Yeah, great question. So some of the podcast also predates me, but I can tell you from just a general historical perspective, the former manager on our team, again, really just like, hey, can I try this? Can I, see if this works? So she, for 5-6 years, really ran it on her own, recording, writing scripts, meeting with the docs, getting the website up and going. Again, very homegrown, limited resource opportunity. When I stepped into my manager role 2.5 years ago, we had a communication specialist at the time who this was also part of her role. So it's kind of been, it hasn't had a ton of resources to date. We're certainly, getting to that point with Jesse. So when there was a vacancy on our team, we hired Jesse. I always tell people she was actually the first person who applied to the job, first resume I saw. And there were, of course, a great, number of candidates, but her resume really spoke to me. That journalism background, I think, has been so helpful. And, maybe Jesse, this is a good segue into your next slide, but there's really, a strategic aim for these podcasts. It really helps the reputation of the hospital. One of the key pillar goals as an organization we have is education. So that's really everything our team does in physician relations is education. So I think now having Jessie here, we recently promoted her this last spring. So she's gearing up to really move into supporting the podcast full time. So the podcasts for her have only been 1/3 of her role to date in the past couple months. But as we look to get into some new spaces with YouTube, maybe a newsletter, some of these different avenues to take the podcast to the next height, she'll really move into supporting the podcast full time. And, I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I certainly hope there's opportunity to grow our podcast personnel and support team, because I think the appetite is there from our listeners, and there's a lot of camaraderie and support from hospital leadership as well.
So Jesse, maybe while you bring up your next slide, Melanie mentioned that you were the first person to apply for this role. What made you decide to apply for this, and what were you doing? What attracted you to this sort of role inside of Children's Hospital Colorado?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I'm a former journalist and national correspondent. So I was working with Scripps National at the time that I decided to not fully hang my hat up on journalism, but to say, let me try something new. So I was here based in Denver. I was traveling 3 weeks out of the month. I was barely home. I was running around the country telling stories of all different, spaces. And my passion has always been in helping people elevate their voices that otherwise don't have an opportunity to do so. And so I didn't really know what was next. I think a lot of people in my shoes can very much understand that most corporations don't really understand what we bring to the table as a journalist. It's a very hard thing to explain to someone how skill sets transfer. And I know Melanie brings this up often, but something that I have on my resume that I encourage all former journalists to have is a small section that says, why hire a former journalist? And I very blatantly outline what I bring to the table and what I hope to show and highlight. And so in my goal of applying for jobs, that I really want to do something where I can continue to tell stories, where I can continue to create, and I can have a hand in making a difference in people's lives. And as I'm sure a lot of people can understand who have been in my shoes, there's a lot of jobs out there that are more internal comms or things where you don't have as much creativity. I've always been a podcast listener, and I always loved editing. It's always been a passion of mine in the video space. So the second I saw that this job description had, being a part of a podcast on there, my ears perked up and I said, all right, I got to learn more about this. I immediately listened, and candidly, I said, wow, they need some help with this production, because as much as the content's amazing, I want to get new equipment. I want to get new this. I want to help change this. I want to help create a new introduction. I mean, I was hungry from the second I heard an episode. And that was things I talked about in my interview, was ways that I could immediately help elevate what was there. They were outsourcing a lot of things, such as editing the podcast. They were paying an outside company to do that. And I said, no problem. I can come in and take that over, easily. So huge change for me in terms of, 9 to 5 and working from home a lot of the time, and hybrid, having holidays off, having time. I mean, even just the amount of time I work in advance in a space like this in comparison to the world I came from. So a ton of change, but a lot of great change. And I think that my skill set really lent itself to push this team in a direction that they had never had the opportunity to be pushed, because maybe they didn't have that voice in the room.
So take us through the next part of your presentation that you prepared.
Yeah. And I wanted to highlight sort of this dedicated personnel piece. Obviously, right now, I'm the only one that's full-time podcast, but I think with any project, you want to ensure that you have the right people, you have the right resources, and you have the right opportunities. And I think from people that don't come from the content space, don't understand how much work something like this actually takes. They listen to a podcast and they're like, oh, I could do a podcast. I could record this. This is easy. And so I really vouched for myself from the get-go to say, this is my favorite part of my job. This is where I would like to be full-time if I'm going to have a career here. I hope that you would invest in me. And Melanie's been my absolute biggest cheerleader from day one to make that happen. And there's been a ton that we've been able to do. Obviously, like I mentioned, certain things we were able to stop paying for, like editing the podcast. There were ways that we haven't really been able to grow, such as creating a new introduction for each episode, how we structure our episodes, taking into account a production schedule, how we vet episodes, creating topics meetings, all these things that I come from a content background of, this is how you properly discuss, vet, and explore ideas. I really brought in from day one. Some of the bigger things that we vouched for example, was a new studio. When I first got here, I had equipment in a reusable shopping bag that I would walk over across the street from our building to the hospital, set up in a conference room, record a podcast episode, pack it all back up, bring it across the street, and then we would do it again for the next episode. And for anyone that handles equipment, this stuff is super sensitive. Like Melanie mentioned, we don't have a lot of resources. So I really wanted to ensure we were spending the appropriate money where needed. And then we weren't going to have to replace things for, the sake of getting it thrown around, or, tearing down and building back up. And so we had been fighting for a new studio for quite some time. As I'm sure a lot of people in the healthcare space understand, getting space in a hospital is so tough. You need space for so many important clinical things, but we're lucky enough to have a building right across the street, and we were able to get our small but mighty studio. It was super fun. I got to fully design and plan this entire thing with our marketing team. And then I, by my own two hands, got to put up the soundproofing and build the furniture and help really bring this thing to life. So last September of 2024, we had our grand opening. Melanie and I got to help, set up the ribbon. We had all of our hosts. We invited everyone that's had a hand. And it has really made a world of a difference, not just welcoming people into our professional space. It's right off you get up. It's right when you get off the elevator. The studio is right there. So it's such a welcoming, wonderful space. People come by all the time and they're like, Gosh, I love seeing how beautiful the studio is. It used to just be a room where people dropped off packages. So, we've been able to bring life to the floor, but also just the quality and the care for the equipment. I'm able to have a space that I can lock and have everything safe and sound. And as you know, as an editor, I need that quiet. So being able to come to the office and edit has really been an incredible advancement for us. And then the other piece of really this dedicated personnel, I mean, from the second I got in here, I said, we need to be live. We need to be in the community. We need to be getting out into spaces that we don't currently exist. You'll probably hear me say this a few times today, but I've been saying it since I got here that we are done growing organically. We've been around for a very long time. And I mean, a great example with you, Dan, that you didn't find our podcast online. So we need to make new efforts to get into new spaces and get in front of people in a creative way. And so we started off with having a live podcast event just right on campus where we invited our internal folks, because in my first week on this new job, I had people say, oh, we have a podcast here. And I was like, yes. So I was like, we just need to spread the awareness internally, but also externally. And I spent about 6 months planning a travel plan for our podcast. And it's been really exciting. We finally launched this summer. We did our first event at a local brewery here in Denver, and we've got a local, regional, and national plan. So I say all this to basically say that having that dedicated personnel allows the right thought process to go into each of these efforts. None of this wouldn't have happened if we didn't have me dedicated to this work, and have the support of somebody like Melanie really cheerleading and leading me, along that path. So it's made a world of a difference in terms of what we've been able to accomplish in such a short period of time.
That's amazing.
Just Jesse, to build off that, I think it's been really important, right, to kind of blend, the expertise Jesse has in content and journalism, in, storytelling, going beyond the white coat, all of these great things, with then the strategic arm and pillar of the hospital, right? So I think there's that kind of creative blend of, okay, Jesse, what can you bring to the table, with knowing, we really want to push the Heart Institute, or we really want to get this message out to community providers across the state, the region, the country. So it's been a really fun partnership just to have someone also dedicated full time to do that with, to have that think tank and really be good partners.
There is a lot to bring together, and I do love the fact that you're also doing live events. We spoke a little bit before we started recording around the use of advertising. You sort of touched on it there in terms of what are you promoting, what sort of services are you trying to make available to the community, and having someone who is dedicated, looking at all those different aspects of the messaging, the awareness months, the things that are happening in the community, the measles outbreaks or whatever there might be that you need to be able to respond to quickly. And you can't print it and get a billboard up necessarily. You might need to actually push it out in an audio format so that people can listen to it while they're driving and while they're in their kitchens and things. So this is really an important piece. So you've got a slide up now that says strong storytelling. So I have to admit that when I think about pediatricians speaking to pediatricians, I don't necessarily think that a storytelling piece falls right in there. A lot of people think of podcasts as interviews, particularly between two people with white coats on. So, but I love that you are focused on this aspect of your content creation. So can you tell us how you factor this in when you're trying to lead these very medical and science-based conversations?
Absolutely. Something I learned very quickly as a journalist is that the medical field, for lack of a better term, can be very sterile. And that's not just in the clinical space. That's also in how we learn, how we talk. And I think that historically and I've heard a lot of doctors tell me this, historically in medicine, seeing that human emotion has been frowned upon. And so I think the industry as a whole is really shifting gears. I talk to doctors all the time who are even talking about how they're being more vulnerable with their patients, sharing personal insights and stories because it makes their patients trust them. For me, that's like storytelling 101, no matter where you are. If you want somebody else to share their, hardest moment or something that's tough for them, if you're not sharing something in return, they're not going to give you the best version of that story, right? And from the beginning of me getting here, you heard Melanie say it, but I've kind of coined this term with our team of going beyond the white coat. I'm like, you are all humans first. Being a doctor comes second. And if your patients don't feel like you are human, if the doctors listening to you don't feel like you're human, then that message is not going to come across stronger. I think we have a ton of lectures and more, for lack of a better word, more boring types of education in medicine. And I think the podcast is a true unicorn of an opportunity to say, let's throw out the window everything we've always told ourselves has to be true to educate somebody, and let's do something a little bit different here. And I think what I've been able to really help highlight with our podcast is that sharing a story that shows that you're vulnerable, or sharing an experience that made you choose that route in medicine, that's 9 out of 10 times going to inspire somebody else to do something better for their patient or for another doctor than it is going to discourage them. So I'll just give one example. We had a doctor, Dr. Lori Sherlock, on the podcast about a year and a half ago, and she tells her story. We were all hysterically crying in the room. But she tells a story about how she was pregnant, walking across the street, and ended up getting hit by a car, lost the baby, and almost lost her own life. And this was while she was in med school. She was training to be a doctor, didn't exactly know the route she was going to go. And ultimately, how the NICU, how the doctors with her being pregnant and the gynecology team, how they all handled her experience, it made her want to care for these newborn babies with the most severe issues, the most severe diagnoses. And it completely changed her outlook in her whole life. And those types of stories, paired with a clinical topic, make people perk up. They make people listen. They make people say, wow, like I actually had an experience that made me think about X, Y, and Z. And so no matter who we have in the studio, I always encourage our guests, if you have a story that made you change your mind about how you do something, please share it. If you have a patient that made you think about something slightly differently than you've always thought about it, please share it. And I do the same thing with our hosts. And I think what we've seen is that people they're letting their shoulders down. They're more themselves. They're having honest conversations. And at the end of the day, we've only gotten positive feedback from that, which I would never have guessed differently. But I think for our hosts to see that in real time and to get the compliments that they do about, wow, your vulnerability made a difference in my everyday, it speaks volumes. And that's why on this slide, I just highlighted, kind of 3 points of highlighting different voices with diverse backgrounds, going beyond that white coat and celebrating the vulnerabilities around being human, and encouraging what's different, as well as always promoting new ideas. That's how I live by my storytelling, book. And I think that everyone should always encourage these opportunities in their podcast space.
As a species, we've been using storytelling for millennia. So thousands of years before there was ever a written language, we were telling stories about how to hunt, how to worship, how to migrate. And the stories are very compelling. They also help build trust, which is the next thing you're going to talk about here. And having those stories, having that relationship, and also being able to use this media, audio media, to give the duration of the stories. It's hard to tell a story in 30 seconds. It's possible, but it's hard. And it might not be as effective when you're trying to build trust, particularly around education, to actually inspire people to do something differently in their practice or in their lives or in the lives of people that they care about. So take us through this next slide here for trust and education. What would you like to share?
Here at Children's Hospital Colorado, we're all very proud of our reputation, right? It speaks for itself, but the podcast has really given us kind of that new angle to engage with people, to offer that education, to really serve as a lifeline. I love, one of our listeners has shared, hey, you're an educational lifeline for me. I think that really speaks volumes to kind of who we are and why we do what we do. So, we're bringing top of the line education to people in their back door, wherever they are. Obviously, we want to continue to grow and cultivate this trust that we've built with the listeners we still have, from the 9+ years. But as Jesse said earlier, we're done growing organically. We have a lot of new people and untapped audiences and markets that we can really get into. So trust remains at the forefront. Obviously, it maintains a long, loyal listener base. And again, even trust internally, right? So our service lines come to us often and say, hey, we've got this great new program, or we'd really love if you guys would consider, promoting this new clinic or this offering or this robotic surgery or, whatever the different clinical medium is. But we're really seen as a trusted partner internally to get the word out and spread that and highlight our clinical expertise. So I think, trust and education go hand in hand. I shared earlier that education is really at the forefront. It's a pillar goal. It's measured. throughout the year with different key performance indicators. But that's what we do in the podcast. And that's, what Jesse shows up to do every day and is always excited to bring. And just going back to the service line piece, Jesse, you can maybe advance to the next slide. Just want to share, for example, the Heart Institute. So this last year, we as a hospital have really been focused on a campaign called Where You Go First Matters. So really emphasizing the importance of when that baby is born, where they go for that first cardiac clinical intervention matters. So the downstream surgeries, the downstream outcomes, their impact to care. So this was a cool way. Jesse had a great idea to kind of pilot and be like, hey, maybe there's a way we can do kind of our own little promotion on the podcast. So we had a couple cardiology focused episodes in the last 2 to 3 months, Jesse. And this clip was added by Jesse and recorded and approved by Heart Institute leadership, senior leadership, and we had the green light to kind of move forward with this as a pilot. So I'll let you play it. And before you do that, just to say and give kudos that I think that's where that journalistic background really shines and that creativity. A couple pillars at the hospital are humble expertise and boundless creativity. So boundless creativity is always at the forefront for us. And I think Jesse does a great job really kind of embellishing that, thinking about new things. And again, we have no idea when we hired her what was even possible. So I'll pause there, Jesse, and let you play this awesome little clip.
Yeah. And actually, super quickly before I play it, I'll also say I think this is where I come in as the journalist in me is always trying to find new ways to do things. And I'm a big believer that as organizations, sometimes we create rules that don't necessarily need to exist. And so was a great opportunity of there's no rules in podcasting. You're allowed to promote your own stuff. Nobody's telling you don't have to. If it resonates well with your audience, let's try it. Let's see what happens. If they don't like it, we can always change and shift. And so I guess I just say that as a reminder to everyone that, there are of course rules and there's brand guidelines and there's things that you want to stick within for your organization. But sometimes we create red tape that doesn't maybe need to exist. So this is an opportunity like any of you might have to say, there's nothing saying we can't do it. Let's try it and see what happens. So I'll play this.
Sure.
Where you go first matters. At Children's Colorado, we take the time to get the diagnosis right. And when surgery is needed, families can trust that it will be performed in one of the highest volume, top-ranked pediatric heart centers in the country, with excellent published outcomes and a commitment to doing what's best for every child.
So this was just a little 20-second kind of add-on we put at the beginning of the episode right before our intro. And, it wasn't necessarily trying to go overboard with advertising a program. I think sometimes the ads and the commercially feel can feel a little bit exhausting for listeners. They always want to skip through that. But this was just a very dedicated sentence or two that felt very natural to the larger goal of what we were trying to promote. And we got some great feedback.
I think that's really wonderful that you're using that. That's an advertisement, technically, I would imagine. But this is where I try to get people to shift off of their interpretation and their view of what an advertisement is. You have listeners who have voted with their fingertips to listen to content that you've created, and they've determined that they're going to receive value from that based on the appearance, their history with previous episodes, where they've discovered that, the person that introduced them to it, the title of what they've decided to click on. All those different things have then caused them to put dedicate their auditory senses to be able to consume that. And now you're giving them an additional service, additional insight. So I think that's really powerful. Now, you actually mentioned that you recorded that and attached it to the episode. Is that accurate? So you actually built it into the MP3 file?
Yeah. So I recorded it separately. I didn't record it during the actual recording.
Right.
If any of you have listened to our podcast, you know that we have 3 different hosts that are all doctors. So for Charting Pediatrics specifically, I am all behind the scenes, but I've sort of taken on that role as the voice for our introductions, for our promo videos, for our commercials or advertisements. So yeah, recorded that separately and then edited in production.
Stitched it into the MP3 file. So not to get too technical to the audience, I don't know all the expertise and interests that people might have, but just from a content perspective, this is where dynamic ad insertion technology really plays a benefit, because that's been recorded by Jesse at that moment in time. But what happens if they want to replace that at some stage? They've got all these MP3 files. They've got over 2 million downloads of these things. If they want to go back to an episode from 2 years ago, 2 months ago, or more, they need to go back and manually edit that. So one of the things to think about is how can dynamic ad insertion technologies allow you to do that, and also geographically target it, because that ad might be more relevant for people who are in proximity of Denver or Aurora and can get there. And you may want to have that space and time and attention by someone in a different part of the world or different part of the country to receive something different that will also add value. So I'm really thrilled that you're doing that. And then I want to also encourage to say, here's how we can go even one step forward to say that instead of baking it in, we can ad insert it based on where people's IP addresses are going up and hitting the servers and downloading things. So not to geek out too much about it, but that's one of the things that we want to think about.
I love that. And I think that's, again, another great learning opportunity for us. We're in the initial stages of talking about how do we maybe make this revenue, generating? How do we maybe target our audience in different spaces? We have a 7-state region that we really focus on as a hospital, but we're now starting to expand that, trying to get, more clients in places like Florida or a Texas that's so far from us, and you would think maybe doesn't have a connection, but it actually does. And so the podcast has a very unique space to be able to target, exactly to your point, Dan, people in these other spaces that maybe aren't a part of our traditional marketing efforts to target those people regionally. So very excited to see kind of where that will go in the future.
It's very commonplace in other types of podcasts, non-healthcare, and there's obviously a lot of concern around ethics and messaging, and that's why a lot of podcasts don't open up and take some of the dynamic ad insertion platforms that are available. But there are ways to curate that and make sure that only your own ads are going into that, and then that way, if someone listens to it in Denver and sends it to their family member, their sister in Florida to listen to, in Florida they'll hear an ad that's relevant for them. So it's also could be seasonal around RSV or flu vaccines. It can be around different awareness topics. It can be around seasonal things around like, hey, it's the start of a new year, or hey, winter's coming, or Thanksgiving's around the corner. Here's some things to think about. So there's different ways to use that technology that is dynamic ad insertion technology that was developed so that we could buy more Diet Coke and flights on Delta Airlines. That's not the way we have to use it. We can use that technology to educate people about their health in an effective way. So thanks for letting me talk about that a little bit in terms of your relation, and excellent work on that advertisement that you produced. We're looking at now a slide that has a testimonial. So can you take us through this?
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to share this. I think all of these things that we've talked about thus far today, and Dan, we talked about this earlier, we could talk for days, right? There's so much to cover, but we really wanted to focus on kind of the high level things that if you're not already doing in your own organization, you could easily learn from. You could take those things and apply it to your own space. And we get a ton of people writing in regularly telling us what our podcast means to them. And we recently got this one, and Melanie and I immediately said we should share this during this presentation. So I'll just read it so you guys can get a feel, but it says, Charting Pediatrics team, I am a junior at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. I'm studying biomedical sciences pre-PA with a minor in public health, and I wanted to reach out and tell you how much I enjoy the podcast and how it has helped me. I've been listening since my sophomore year of college, and at first I didn't understand much. However, after taking my lower level biology, anatomy, and public health courses, I was able to recall some of the concepts and vocabulary I learned from the podcast. Now, when I listen, I get excited when I hear topics we covered in class, and I'm able to understand words and concepts I would have otherwise not understood. I wanted to thank you all for your hard work, and I wanted to let you know that your work is helping me in my journey toward becoming a pediatric physician assistant. And so we constantly talk about the future, and I think that the future lies in the hands of the youngest generation that wants to become health professionals. And that has been a huge push since I've gotten here is, yes, we want to focus on that PCP audience, but our next big group is really the med student population. And they are the future. They are who's excited. They are the ones who are going to take all of the possibilities with health podcasting and make it a reality. Our next live podcast event is actually in October, and we're doing it in conjunction with the University of Colorado, who we have a strong partnership with. And we're doing an entire episode and live event around the med student experience and how PCP offices really should be rethinking this next generation of doctors that they're going to be hiring, bringing into their offices, conversations around social media, media and these parents that, believe truth when they see something online. And so all these things, I think, affect all of us in healthcare. And it's people like this that, make me smile and remind me that the work we're doing is so important. And so I guess I'll just, again, for those of you who maybe haven't started your podcast, or if you don't have somewhere for people to write in, create that. Like, give yourself that boost and that opportunity to hear from your listeners. It's why we're talking about getting a newsletter and finding more opportunities to get feedback in real time. So much of what we've done and changed and shifted has come from our audience members themselves. Yes, I am an expert in content, but I don't know everything, and I'm not a healthcare expert. So I rely so heavily on the people that listen and digest this to help guide. So, don't be afraid to lean on your listeners as an incredible resource to help move you forward.
A lot of creators will ask listeners to leave reviews on Apple or Spotify or other sites, but they don't realize is that you can't respond to those and you can't ask follow-up questions. So if you give people an opportunity to connect with you through your website or through your social media, you can not only use it the way you just did, but you can also inquire more. What else would you like to hear? How did you discover this? Where did you find this? How can we reach more people like you? Where would you like to see us go? And actually, would you like to have some sort of role? Would you like to be an ambassador or champion for this? Would you like to submit ideas for our topics? If you're out and about and you hear a great lecture, let us know. Maybe that's something we need to cover and incorporate into our content. So getting that conversation started is really important. You both have been really generous with your time. Thank you so much for putting together this presentation. I just want to ask a couple closing questions, and that is for anyone in the audience that's listening to this and thinking about, how do I get started? What would you say about the way that they can get started, but also what they should be thinking about in terms of the ROI on this? A lot of organizations need to justify this. They need to justify the creation of it, which your hospital did. They need to think about the allocation of resources and the time that each of you are committed to doing this sort of thing. And if you just measure in downloads, there's no revenue associated with that. So how do you justify this as an organization? And then what would you say to organizations that are considering this in terms of the steps that they should consider and how they can make this a reality?
I mean, I think for us, right, we're unique. Education, it's at the forefront of our mission. It's embedded in everything we do. So part of this started, right, as a little bit of just the goodwill for the greater good. Now, I think fast forward, there is really that strategic aim, that strategic arm. We are actually, it's funny, Dan, as you bring up, how do we measure this? We're in the midst of a strategic plan for the podcast as well. So I think that's going to fuel some new initiatives, new vehicles to support the podcast, like YouTube, this newsletter, more live events, more travel, things like that. So we're actually internally toying around, how could we look at a potential connection to referrals or downstream patient connection into the hospital? I think one of the things we've been talking about, right, is these podcasts can serve as a front door to our hospital. They can really get people in the door, get them exposed. They learn more about our institution. They'll think of us first when they have, a sick kiddo, a sick patient. So I think it's also really focused and embedded in that national reputation building. And just again, oh, I remember when, right? And then people having Children's Hospital Colorado in their ear.
Yeah, a few things to bounce off of that. I always make the comparison of we all know St. Jude. Why do you know St. Jude? It's because they're everywhere. And I would love to talk to somebody internally there to really understand their ROI and how maybe that happened, because I think that in and of itself, reputation and recognition needs to be looked at differently from the podcast lens that maybe other typical marketing tools do. Because at the end of the day, the more people trust you and they hear you and they understand what you offer, the more often that you're going to come front of mind. When I talk to families who, when I was a journalist, I got to work with a lot of families who worked with St. Jude. And I asked, why St. Jude? And it's because somewhere subconsciously it was baked in and embedded in their brain. And when they got that bad news about their kid, that trust piece immediately came forward and it said, it's a no-brainer. Kind of similar to a Ronald McDonald House experience. These are the things that are just kind of universally known and embedded in those people's brains. So from that ROI, and I know, people who come from strategy don't always love this answer, and I don't have a strategic background, I have a content background. But for me, recognition and reputation needs to be considered at a higher standard than it is, because at the end of the day, that's how we'll get into more people's ears, and that's how we'll get them to recognize us and to want to come here. Now, in terms of how do you start? I think Melanie shared earlier that we sort of started in this very basement, organic, like we don't know what we're doing type of environment, and look what we've become. So I guess the suggestion I would give is, if you have an opportunity to try something, try it. I say it all the time because I'm so not used to working in an environment where people have to, you have to create like a plan, and you have to have buy-in, and you have to have all this stuff kind of pre-created. I come from the world of, let me create this and show it to you, and then you'll see the power of it. And so I think there's been a nice balance there, right? Where I've gotten more opportunities for them to say, okay, this maybe isn't in our traditional wheelhouse of how we would plan or handle, but we trust Jessie. So like, we're going to let her run with this and we'll see what happens. And so I think a little bit of that, like having the right people that you trust to try something. And again, you don't have to make this a full-blown effort. You can dedicate one person or a few hours a week to just have somebody try this and see what happens. Podcasting, I believe, is a very like low risk, high reward type of situation. You can go and buy a very cheap microphone that will give you slightly better audio than your computer. You could even do it on your iPhone. I mean, you could create a fake product to showcase to your leaders in a very simple way. And them seeing that result is what could drive them to make the next decision. So I guess suggestion number one is find the opportunities, find the holes that exist, and try it and see what happens. And second, I would say, if this ends up being something that you have buy-in for and you see a real opportunity for, then fight for having the right resources. I look at us, and while we have so much more than other teams, the fight is not going to stop. Melanie mentioned earlier, like, we want to add more people. We want to add more podcasts. We want to do so many more things. So celebrate your wins and be proud of your wins, but don't let that stop you from continuing to fight the good fight of advancing and evolutionizing what podcasting can do for your industry and your space.
Excellent. So we'll leave it there. Where can people find more of your content, connect with each of you, and any other places where you'd like for people to connect?
Yes. So you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. So definitely check out Charting Pediatrics. And if you speak Spanish, check out Pediatrics in Linea. For those of you who ever go to the national conferences, we normally have a presence there with our Children's Hospital Colorado booth. So both the American Academy of Pediatrics and PAS are two big conferences that we normally record podcasts at. So feel free to come stop by and say hello if you're ever there. You can visit our website, which is Charting Pediatrics, Children's Hospital Colorado /Charting Pediatrics, and find all of our details there. And then lastly, you can always email me. I would love to hear from all of you. My email is Jessie, JESSIE.Mankle, MANKLE, at children's, with an S, colorado.org. I'm happy to always jump on a call or have you on if you're an expert in the field and want to be on our podcast. But we love conversations. We love to interact. So don't be afraid to reach out.
And I would say people can always find us on LinkedIn. We're there. So that's another great resource as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll include some of those links in the description of this session. We won't include your email address and text just to protect that. But if people are listening, then people will be able to get in touch with you. And it is Jessie Cohen, but also Jessie Mankle. So Jessie Mankle on the email and then Jessie Cohen on the side. So thank you, Jessie Cohen, Melanie Douglas. Thank you both very much for taking time and for all you're doing in podcasting and healthcare, and for being a part of Health Podcast Summit.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you so much. This was fun.